Okay, so mostly we played with it, a couple projects underway. That's good. Okay, so still a lot of new eyes on Drupal 8. And so non-developers, there's 3 or 4 of you in the room. Okay, great. And your roles are more on the management side, the business side, the sales side, where?
Innovation funding.
Okay.
Management.
Okay.
Sales.
Great. Okay, so quite the hybrid of people in the audience and the Drupal experiences. So I'm going to talk about some sort of high-level points about Drupal and Drupal 8 specifically. Nice tight desk up here. Get everything fit in. Okay, I'll leave that. So yeah, I've basically got, well, now I've got 12 points on the slide presentation here to talk about. I added one while we were actually talking just before we got started here. So that doesn't give a lot of time to really dig into some of these details. It's mostly just high level, but we can talk about it afterward, and certainly there's lots of information on the web and whatnot I can point you to dig in a bit deeper. So in a 45-minute presentation, I can talk about very little about Drupal 8, it feels, but I've talked about Drupal 8 in more depth in 2 hours or 3 hours even. There's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of new things in it to discuss. So with that being said, we'll just get started. Right, but first, I guess Mike gave an introduction to who I am, but yeah, basically, that's me, full stack Drupal developer, and you can find out more at that link there. One thing I will say, and Mike hinted at this, is the photography side of what I do. I'm a part-time professional photographer. Whenever I go to Drupal conferences or Drupal events, I'll take the camera with me, and the day before, day after, maybe a bit more, I'll go around and go photograph things. And I specialize in photographing abandoned buildings. It seems maybe a bit niche, but it's fun. It's nice and quiet spaces. And you'll see some of those photos in the slides. And maybe just before, I don't slides at all. I like to present maybe a couple of ideas and talk about how some of these point real world production examples or use cases for where they might be needed and that kind of thing. So. Anyway, that's enough about me. Photo was taken after DrupalCon Barcelona on a road trip through France, abandoned discotheque of all places. And I normally don't do selfies, but I thought, well, maybe I'll get one in there. Anyway, enough of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is the improvements to the authoring experience in Drupal 8. That's a photo of an abandoned high school in Detroit, which has now since been demolished. But books, authoring, thought it might be some similarities there. Anyway, so Drupal 8 has a totally revised authoring experience. There are some nods and pointers from other CMSs, some we're familiar with, WordPress being a good example. It seems to be the leading CMS in terms of the editorial experience, at least in terms of the UI itself. So one thing I want to do is I will go through using Drupal 8 live here so you can see it actually in action and what we can do with that. So, the slides, up in the browser. So I've already got an installation of Drupal 8 up and running. Often I'll walk through the process of how to get that running. Composer is a tool now that's being used a lot to get Drupal 8 up and running, but just to save some time, I wanted to just jump in and have an installation ready. So, we're going to create content. What would you like me to call this piece of content? Give me a title. Give me anything.
Somewhat creative on the spot.
Go for it. What's the last tech article you read? What was it about? Anybody?
Drupal vulnerabilities, actually.
Oh, all right. But Drupal's really secure.
That's because it's Wednesday.
That's because it's Wednesday, yeah, exactly.
Because it's Wednesday, yeah, good call. So what I'll do is I'll just create an article type. So of course Drupal comes with some built-in content types. These haven't really changed with Drupal 8. They're the same as the Drupal 7, more or less. So I'll just create an article and we'll call it Drupal vulnerabilities. And it gets spelled on the first try. So since I'm not going to do lorem ipsum, actually I will, since I've got a good Wi-Fi connection here. I should do Riker ipsum, like I used to in the past. Oh well. Actually, I will do that. We're all Star Trek fans here?
Yes.
Yes? All right. Well, I don't want this one. I want the other one. Here we go. And it's not working. All right. Well, forget that one. We will go to the old one. Good enough. All right. So now we've got a title and some text. We'll just walk through the interface quickly. So Drupal 8 comes with a WYSIWYG built in, based on CK Editor, which is great. So there's arguments back and forth about having one, not having one. Not having one, you can actually install your own and customize it and so on. But generally speaking, I think every installation of Drupal I've seen in the last number of years has CK Editor built in, unless it's some specialized context for having a different editor in there. So it's in there by default. If you're familiar with Drupal 7, which I think everybody in the room maybe is, or we'll just assume that for the presentation anyway, this meta information for the post was actually below the content authoring area. And now it's been moved over to the side, so it's in visual view. So everything's on a single page, at least in the desktop view. We'll touch on other viewports in a second here. But basically, we've got a WYSIWYG in there and several posting options and items in here. And set menus and comment settings on or off and authoring information and so on. So it's quite nice like that. And there's also enhanced save options here, save as published, save and publish, sorry, save as unpublished, and you can even do a preview. So we'll just save and publish. And there's your post right there. So some additional elements to this that are new with Drupal is the ability to do inline editing. You can do a quick edit and take out the comma, make it simple, save, and there we go. And then there's also just a direct button that takes you right into the editing view again and go back to view. And then the comments that are in there, basic Drupal commenting system. So that's it. That experience didn't exist with Drupal 7. It's new in Drupal 8, and it's proving to be obviously very useful. So that's about 5 minutes worth of the editing experience. You can also go back into the content area and you can, again, add content, basic pages, and so on. And you can create your own content types and have your own variations on how to input content into Drupal. Any questions so far? No? Pretty straightforward? Awesome. All right. Oops. All right. So migration. That is a big topic. There's a lot of Drupal 6 sites out there, a lot of Drupal 7, a lot of other CMSs looking towards migrating into Drupal 8 or whatnot. We're going to focus on Drupal 6 and a little bit of Drupal 7 here. I guess for context, the photo is an abandoned tuberculosis hospital in New York State. Migration, I don't know, the closest I can get is the decay is migrating up to the dome there. The focus on migrating into Drupal 8 is, I guess you could say it's specific to Drupal 6 because Drupal 6 is now at end of life. It's been that case for almost 6 months, or maybe it is 6 months now. And so there's a need and a desire to get content, sites and content out of Drupal 6 and into Drupal 8. There are some very fresh tools to do that. When Drupal 8 was released, there were some migration tools built in, but there was no UI, and they were actually very, I don't want to say ineffective, but they really didn't complete the purpose that they were meant to serve. The foundational work was there. However, with Drupal 8.1 now being released and Drupal 8.2 just around the corner, about October, sometime in October, I forget the actual date, but it's coming up soon. There are more mature migrate tools in there, and I haven't actually played with anything that's related to 8.2. Maybe we can play with that here now, but basically, we've got these migrate tools and a UI, and is this the 8 dev? All right. Let me just combine tools where I can sort of default administration interface elements. I think I'll just leave those for the moment. I don't D6 site on my machine that I can actually run the base. And we click through it and do everything through it, and it should work. So these tools didn't exist, but multilingual. That's especially in relation to New Brunswick. A little bit in Ontario, obviously very strong in Quebec. Is the feature of all of the Drupal additional modules and some of the core modules, which you'll see here. These are all core. Some are turned on, some are not. There are different use cases for having some on and otherwise. Everything else is added in, as well as some example modules here for caching and other experimental, experimental for caching and migration and so on. We'll just leave those for the moment. So to turn on multilingual capabilities in Drupal 8, if you're using the interface, as I am here, all you have to do is check these 4 boxes and click install. And as long as nothing breaks, it should work. For a developer, there would be command line commands that you would use to turn these on. I won't get into that at this moment, but typically this is not the way a developer would turn these on, for those of you in the audience who are not the developer mindset. Okay, so now everything is turned on for multilingual. And now go into configuration. And so you can see the default here is English, and I will add a language. I will pick French. So now what's happening here is there are language files on Drupal.org, and the system is grabbing the French language file and it's appearing quite a bit here. There we go. Okay, so it's grabbed the French language file and it's there. So all I need to do is select it and save. And now several elements of the interface are in French. Now, this isn't translating content. That is done in a different way, but this is for the interface itself. So most of what you see on the screen has been translated. This 0.05 might be some of the items that you see missing here. But overall, you'll see all of the basic language elements for the CMS have been changed to French. And it's that simple. In the past, it would be a much more complex process, but it's really just a matter of enabling 4 of the core modules and grabbing the language file and setting the defaults. And I'll go back and change it because je ne parle français or un petit peu or something like that. Yeah, my French is quite rusty. Yeah, 99.76%. So that's it for translations in the interface. Translations in the content itself. Actually, I'm going to skip that for a second. Yeah, I'm going to save a couple things for near the end. All right, multilingual capabilities. Okay, Any questions so far? I know I'm breezing through a lot of stuff here.
So how well is Drupal 8 caught up for, I'm going to say localized dialects? Like the big issue we have here is, core, what I call France French, or kind of traditional French.
Right.
Doesn't entirely always work out our way, because even with the Canadian French and even when you get into Acadian French, things tend to deviate quite a bit. I think there were some projects in 7 you could download manually for Canadian French, for example.
Yeah.
I don't know if that same kind of thing would be available here.
So it's the same basic situation. So the languages that are available are what's available on Drupal.org. So whatever's there is what you can use here. What you're seeing are the available defaults. Yeah, in terms of those dialects, whatever is already translated is what's there, and it's all a contributed process, right? So naturally, you're going to have regular French and regular English. I guess that would be UK, American, or whatnot. Those are obviously going to be the defaults, and they will be translated more than other dialect languages, but or dialect versions of languages, I guess. But yeah, basically, what's on Drupal.org is what's available. So I don't know, like Acadian French, for example, I don't know what the translation state of that would be.
You probably wouldn't see Acadian French, but you might see Canadian French.
Yeah.
I think there was a project for it, because you do have issues, and I've had to deal with it myself, where the default French isn't good enough, because we have localizations in spelling, things have to be done a certain way, and some folks will get rather upset if it's not exactly the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're working on a project for the government of Quebec, for example, or something related to that, then yeah, you would need to have that very specific dialect. So again, this is what's available in core Drupal 8. Specialized cases are going to need some specialized work, for sure. I know, for example, the Japanese translations, it's at maybe 90% or something like that. It's the same example. There's a growing base of Drupal developers there, but when you're selling a business, they don't want to see 10% of it missing, so it's a bit of a harder sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would be the same situation with, say, all right, so really this image isn't in bad taste. Really has come a long way into and we're accessible. Thank you. Right, so Drupal 8 supports this initiative and accessibility support out of the box. And some of that relates to the interface itself and also the output and that sort of thing. So I'll here the web accessibility ARIA overview initiative and so on. Accessibility concepts and so on are supported. HTML5 output in Drupal 8 is accessible, supports accessibility standards. Alt text is mandatory for images, and basic things like link underlining and also color contrast within the interface has been improved for accessibility standards. There's a whole host of other items as well. I just noticed this blog post. I haven't had a chance to really dive into it too much, but we talk about obviously a very seeing the year-to-date websites and those support. And they go through some different techniques, keyboard testing, screen reader audit, and not just Dolly, but also Hillary Clinton's site, and doing a review on that and tools that they're using and various of accessibility and using this and so on. So it's worth a read just to see how these various tools are used to do audits and to see how good Drupal 8's actually is accessibility support. So maybe I can share that link afterwards. Looks pretty interesting. Right, performance. I an ironic joke about the car being abandoned and so on in performance, but that being said, so Drupal 8 provides some interesting performance enhancements, some built into the interface, some taking nods from Facebook technology, and maybe even some specific technologies like React and so on. We'll dig into those quickly here. So, tablet sliding, fall off onto the floor. So Facebook has this technology called BigPipe, and what that really does in a nutshell is, instead of loading the entire page, it's doing selective loading depending on the situation and circumstance. In some senses, this is just like React. If any of you are familiar with React at all, it's a JavaScript library that Facebook has released. It's taking the JavaScript world by storm. And what React does is you have your document object model, the DOM, and when something on the page needs to be refreshed, it doesn't reload the entire DOM. It just loads elements of the DOM, if you will, branches in the tree, if you want to talk in terms of metaphors. And BigPipe does this. So it doesn't really increase performance. It gives the perception of enhanced performance. There's a lot of technical detail to go into how that really works, but the Facebook folks have a diagram here, which maybe I'll just show this one. It's a little hard to see. I'll zoom this in a little bit. But let's say if this section needs to be updated, but the rest of the page hasn't needed that requirement, or there aren't any updates happening, it will just load and reload this particular segment. And BigPipe in Drupal operates in the same basic principle, where it's doing selective loading depending on the context of what's happening on the page. And that's a new innovation for Drupal. And you can kind of see some of the performance, chart of performance in the different browsers at the various speeds. So BigPipe, we're not talking small gains here. This is actually pretty significant, and it's happening on the front end. So Drupal has now adopted that. It was experimental in Drupal 8.0, and it's now available in 8.1. It's a big enhancement there. And then there's also accelerated mobile pages. I've been digging into this to a certain degree, but there's still a lot for me to personally learn. But the basic idea is that there's the accelerated mobile pages standard, and when you install this contributed module, it will apply the enhancements to mobile delivered pages. So there's also, and as we know, when you're on a phone, you need really fast performance and very streamlined performance, and it provides that too. So there's some articles on AMP, and just bring this up quick. So there's the Velachi folks, they put out a blog post that kind of covers some of the technical side of it and some of the marketing side of it. If you want to search for this, again, we'll share links after the fact, but you could just search for Velachi and AMP, and you'll get to this post. And yeah, they basically talk about it from the two different sides. And really, it's just talking about the speed enhancements of the site, and then some of the technical background behind why things are faster in it. And the use cases for why you would want speed in certain situations, more speed in certain situations. So we'll share those links out as well later. Right. Drupal 8 also offers a lot of behind-the-scenes caching support too. Various entities are cached by default and so on. There's a lot going on in the background that enhances the performance as compared to Drupal 7. So, new theming system. This is huge for the front-end development people. There is a new templating engine called Twig. It's based on the Symfony framework. Drupal 8 incorporates several components from Symfony, and this is one key part of it. So basically, in a nutshell, I will actually show some code for this, but what's happening is it's more secure and faster because you're not allowed to write PHP code into the template files anymore. So there's performance enhancements, security enhancements, and so forth. And it's also good, something I haven't really touched on yet is that with regards to Drupal working with other developer communities and other platforms, there's a lot of integration possibilities, and as I mentioned, the Symfony components are in Drupal 8 as well. It opens the door to bring in Meetup. We had a Symfony, a little bit of Twig quickly. Templates. Let's just go into basically a sort of page. Just give it a second to load. And same with the bride. This is the background, like in the past. There's still some processing going on, but I quite like that. Even footer section, this generates the footer content of the page. Sorry, I should make that bigger again. And it's pretty straightforward. It's actually simpler to learn than if you have no experience as a PHP developer, you don't have to learn language. You just have to learn the twig system and the tags, and it's generally pretty straightforward. It's all basically like this. This is adding CSS classes to this particular div tag. It's just fun to see. And the great thing is Twig is used for other content management systems, and for developers come in and do front-end theming and work with your team, and the adoption is the Drupal learning curve is less steep because of this. That's really generally what I'm trying to say on that. This one too. So this generates the core framework of the HTML page and what's being output. And again, you've got the page top, page, and the page bottom. So those are the sections of the page. Your basic body tag, and it's adding CSS classes to it. And I guess that's probably enough to cover on that. What's your favorite feature of Twig?
You know what, I just actually started diving more in depth into it because I've just been tinkering around with it, but I just like it because I have OCD, so I can keep everything really clean with it.
Yeah. That helps.
Yeah, it helps. And I find for me too, because I've only done a little bit of theming with D7, but I did find it a little more, and I code too, but it's just trying to sometimes wrap my brain around the syntax of it. It's just much easier.
Yeah, the mixture of PHP code with markup.
It can get pretty messy.
It can be.
If you go into a project that you're just thrown into and you need to know what's going on, sometimes the learning curve in that is.
Yeah, for the non-developers in there, the problem we had in the past, or one of the problems, I suppose, from the front end side of Drupal, Drupal 6 and 7, and maybe even further back, is that PHP developers would come in and do theming on Drupal, but they would embed their PHP code within the template system.
Right.
And it caused some of the problems I mentioned, like in terms of security and also efficiency. And there were best practices to deal with that, where you would keep it in files that weren't specific to the front-end templates. But it didn't always happen, so we wind up with situations where there'd be spaghetti code everywhere. And this forces that kind of cleanliness, which, as I said before, makes the CMS run faster and more efficient and more secure. One thing I was hoping that you might hint on, but maybe you haven't gotten into this too far, is debugging mode for Twig.
Oh, it's
so you can turn on debugging mode and see in the code when you're opening up some of the debug tools within the browser, you can actually see which template file is generating what part of the page. So it makes debugging much faster as well. So it speeds up the development process too. I really love it, but again, I could spend an hour just going through various pieces of front-end Drupal with Twig and the differences and enhancements and so on, but zip through things. All right. Right, so mobile optimizations. Drupal 8 is mobile ready out of the box. What that means is I could actually, my phone's over there, but if I brought up my demo site on my phone, I can actually administer the site from there. I can add content, I can do basic authoring on there, I can add images, I can actually run the administration of the Drupal 8 site itself as the admin user. And I can give you a quick demo of what that looks like, even though I'm on my desktop here. So maybe I'll go to this page. Actually, I'll go into the edit mode here. Okay, so this is that content that I created before. So I'm going to shrink this down to be tablet sized. Get the menu out of the way. And now it's phone sized. So we've got 3 basic breakpoints. So you can edit on your phone. And now this menu moves down here. And if I bring it back up to the tablet size, it pops into place like that. And sorry, there's your tablet size and there's your phone size. So you can see the menu at the top is changing to match the various display sizes. Like that. So for those of us who worked on Drupal in the past, many years for me and several years for others and so on, this is like a miracle. This is amazing. I don't know what else to say about it really. Just being able to do the editing on the mobile and having it be mobile ready. The theme framework is mobile ready too. There are several areas where you can code in your breakpoint sizes, and you can set up your theme to be mobile friendly as well, based off of Drupal core. What else can I say about this quickly? Basically, all of the interface is mobile friendly. Appearance, get that out of the way. Same basic thing, picking your themes after they're installed. It is mobile friendly like that. Back to the site, and then the actual front end view of it. See things are moving around. And this is just basic default Drupal 8, the front end theme that's set up by default. So it's pretty flexible that way. And I mean, we live in a mobile world now. The sites I work on are anywhere from 30 to 50 to 60% front end mobile phone and tablet sized usage. So that's just the reality of what box really. I taught a section of this. I do Java programming, and a lot of this is due to hosting on some shared server somewhere. And then as Drupal became more and more enterprise friendly and geared towards enterprise, we needed to have more complex systems in place to actually run Drupal. So you would set up a staging server and your live server, or maybe a development server, a test server, and a live server. And moving configuration from one version of Drupal to another version of Drupal in your staging system became a big headache. There are modules in place, modules that became, and it became quite messy. So what happened is some hosting platforms created Pantheon, for example, or Acquia. They have these systems in place where you can create your dev server, your test server, and so on, and they move the data back and forth between the different systems depending on what's actually going on with your development at the time. But it gets quite messy. So what has happened for Drupal 8 is this initiative called Configuration Management, which will take care of the heavy lifting on that particular purpose. So I'll show that in the interface really quickly. And again, a lot of this can be done within code behind the scenes, but just for the purposes of the demo here, I'll show it in the system itself. So configuration would be something like turning on caching for CSS. So actually, I'll show you that really quickly here. Open up a fresh tab, go to performance, and I can turn off CSS aggregation or not. So for example, I'll turn it off and save it. Now if I go back to my tab with configuration, I can actually export it. I'll do a single item, and I can choose which one I want. I'll just choose something random. How about a content type? So this is the actual configuration code for the content type itself. for the basic page content type. So what I'm going to do is I've copied that, and I'm going to import. So I'm going to pretend I have another site up and running, and I'll pretend I'm importing a single item, and I'll say I want the content type, and I'll paste in the code here. Now just title, we'll do an import. Confirm it. And now if I go to my structure and my content types, we don't see it because something didn't work right. I knew that was going to happen. Configuration. So what probably happened, because the UUIDs were the same, it probably just overwrote the other one. So if I had two separate sites, and I've done this in the past where I demoed two separate Drupal 8 sites, and I deleted the content type out of one, and then imported one a variation of that content type from the old system into the other one, and it showed up, and it worked totally fine. You could do full exports and imports into various systems. And this is all done from the interface itself. And what's happening is, I don't think I've got this turned on, but let me just do a quick check here. Okay, so basically what's happening here, another point I wanted to touch on too is that in the past, any configuration was stored in the database, and now it can be stored within the file system itself, which means that it can be managed via source control, which is a great feature as well. Okay, I've spent enough time on that. I'll jump through quickly here. Web services APIs. Right, so web services APIs. So we live in a world where we're not just browsing on the desktop anymore. We're using our phones and refrigerator displays and you name it. We're putting content on it, watches and all that sort of stuff. So Drupal's great at managing content, but the front end of Drupal wasn't always really friendly for those viewports or devices, if you will. So a lot of work went into what's called web services for Drupal 8. And essentially all that means is you can take the content of Drupal 8 and output it in a particular format, JSON being the most popular one, and it can be consumed by any device or platform even. For example, Angular or React as front-end frameworks. And the popular application is single-page apps. Yeah, in a nutshell, that's basically the idea. So just taking Drupal's content and outputting it into a format that's friendly for any other device or consumption of that data so that it can be displayed anywhere. There's so much I could tell.
I read that somewhere that Tesla was going to be using Drupal to power displays in their vehicles or parts of it. Yeah,
that's so we don't really know for sure, but that's a rumor that's based on it being used on their own website. Dries wrote something about that. I'm trying to remember the context for what he said. Does anybody recall that at all or read it themselves? No, I'm not sure, but that would be a great example too, for sure. Yeah, like in-car displays or really anywhere that you can display data that is content-driven. Web services and Drupal's web services APIs are a great use case for that.
There's a lot of healthcare organizations in the U.S. who are doing that, right? They're exporting it out to different devices.
Yeah.
Tablets, phones, patients can access another phone. It's really quite cool what they're able to do.
Yeah, patient data is a key one, yeah. Very content-heavy applications. It's perfect for that. So there are some examples, and I guess I'm kind of jumping into the next point too, is decoupling options. So decoupling is essentially what I just hinted on, is using Drupal as a content store and administration, and then using a whole different front-end system to display it. So you can use a React app or an Angular app or Ember or anything really. And if you're getting that data pumping out of Drupal, you can consume it and display it in any way you can think of. The healthcare application is one. So you can obviously do mobile-friendly displays of a website, but we're talking applications in this case. So you can write an iOS app or an Android app or what have you, and display that Drupal data out of Drupal. And you can actually also use it as an interface for inputting the data as well. The popular option at the moment seems to be just to use it as a display mechanism and then log into Drupal and do the administering of the content there, because it has very powerful workflows and workflow management, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, the world we live in is one where devices are infinite and everywhere. So it's just a matter of doing those kinds of data outputs and displays. Another example too is solar. Did we lose power? Oh, sorry, I thought the TV died for a second. Is solar farm installations or solar power installations in Northern Ontario. I know a Drupal developer whose boyfriend, partner, or whatever, is working up there, and they have to interact with a Drupal site, but often they're offline. So what can happen is your device can hold the data in either the browser's built-in database or some SQLite database of some kind, and then once you get connected back to the internet, it will sync that data up to the Drupal website, and so that content goes back into the site, or fresh content goes into the site, so that it can be managed that way. So that's actually a really great example of what decoupling can do, where you can also have direct access to the Drupal database and the Drupal installation. So being able to store that on your local device, which is, you know, the era of the dumb terminal is kind of gone now. We've got these devices that can hold lots of data. It will sync up back with that Drupal site, and boom, you've got your content managed for, in this case, well, in that case, I guess Ontario Hydro, and then, you know, any other power company who is managing those solar devices, or whatever the use case might be. So that's decoupling. Oh, and yeah, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the Drupal 8 Teams. So, and Teams is loosely termed in a sense. Oh, do you want the context for the image?
Yeah, I guess it's
okay. So it's an abandoned high school in upstate New York, and it's the auditorium, and the story goes that urban explorers who go in and photograph these places and explore them place the bears on the front row as a superstition. It's probably just people setting up photos, but anyway, and those were toys that were in the children's room. There was a daycare or something in there at one point. And they're a very solid team, as you can see, except for the one guy in the back who's using Joomla. Had to go there. So yeah, Drupal 8 Teams. So this actually speaks to maybe a broader topic of, is Drupal 8 ready for production on enterprise sites? And you know, what's available to work with? Is Drupal 8 Contrib available and ready to work with? Are Drupal developers or non-Drupal developers ready to get into Drupal 8? Is it the right time? I would check yes to almost all of those boxes, and I'll show a couple of reasons why. So for starters, and we're almost kind of talking about new Drupal features, but let me just jump into the Drupal module charts, for example. So modulecharts.org was really useful for a while, and now it's become less useful because everything is green. So in the Drupal world, for those of you that don't know, there are obviously a popular list of most used modules. So once you install Drupal and you need to start adding to it and developing with it, you realize that, well, I need to be able to have meta tag support for Google, and I need to be able to link in my Google Analytics code, and I need to have additional admin tools, and et cetera, and front-end development modules to create really interesting seamless layouts, and the list goes on and on and on. Support for video embedding and everything like that. And when Drupal 8 was first released almost a year ago, this was all red. But now the top 25 are almost all green, or in some cases, some modules are in beta stages and so on. And if I expand it to 100, it's basically the case all the way through. Lots of green, or almost shades of green, and so on. So there's a huge amount of support now for what's called Drupal, contributed modules. And there are still some use cases where something might not be ready and might need a custom option, or maybe the module needs to be ported from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And there are tools to do that. Sometimes they require a little more brute force, and other times there is an actual module that will help you to upgrade your module. It feels very meta. And I haven't actually tried this. I've played around with porting some modules, but I hear this actually works very well. So I can't really comment on it in any kind of great way, but it's there, the Drupal module upgrader. So basically what I'm getting at is the support for Drupal 8 is actually quite broad now, and only in some fringe cases are some elements of the Drupal contributed ecosystem not quite ready. Drupal 8 itself, in terms of its performance and use cases out in the wild, it's being used on, I know colleges are using it, and there are small to mid-sized companies using it in organizations. I've got some project work on the go with a nonprofit and a large in terms of user interfaces, before you could do code, now you can do these things through the way it speeds up, or it gives you the those are in there now. Tons of various things. Some things that are very specific to developers. So many elements to right, revisions are on by default. You want to be able to track flow, that's available, and now the revisions are turned on by default, which makes sense, they should be. Let's see, what else do we have here? Some very simple interface improvements. What are some that are worth mentioning? Oh, the editor itself. I can bring this up. So this is an installation on my local. The migration modules that I showed, those are actually part of 8.2 in terms of experimental modules. Right, yeah. So the foundations for migration were built into Drupal 8, but Drupal 8.0, but the UI and various other elements are in version 8.2. Go back to here quickly. Big pipe is in there by default. They still call them experimental, more as a safety mechanism than anything else. But just wait for that to save. Okay. There we go. Inline form errors, that's another addition as well. Those weren't in there by default, but now they are. Go back into this. All right, so it's the same basic interface for that in 8.2. What else? More developer-friendly items. View modes are enabled for comments now, so that's a nice important piece. A couple of things in the interface, just in terms of like when you create a new item, there's a link to it right after you save it. So little performance enhancements and things like that for development. I'm trying to think here, what else can I talk about? Should I talk about anything else? Any questions so far? Thoughts? What does everyone like most so far that they've seen? I know I breezed through a lot of stuff, but is there anything in particular that caught your eye or you think might be particularly useful for an upcoming project, or? No? We're switching to WordPress? Okay.
I think the integration stuff, the API stuff, we've done a lot of that in the past, right?
Yeah.
We integrate a lot with Alfresco, Salesforce, things like that. I think having that built in is going to make that a really interesting conversation with clients, right? As they're moving to this,
Yeah.
you can exposed data and have it go into different applications. It's really interesting.
Actually, that's a great point too. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. So yeah, Salesforce is a great example. Other tools like MailChimp and so on, like a really prominent third-party tools that are used for high-performance, high-intensity operations like mass mailing and mass accounting and those sorts of features. Yeah, they're huge.
When you get into the conversation of portals, for example, and integrating marketing systems like Marketo or something like that, and having all of that work together, you get into some really interesting things that you can do using technology.
The marketing automation has always been a thing where in Drupal 7 there wasn't a whole lot of ways to really empower marketing automation within the software. And I think now with the integration with services, marketing automation will have a better place.
Definitely.
One of the things I liked in the theming layer, especially within the core theme, like the classy thing and stuff like that, Drupal's been kind of embracing the idea of the principle of atomic.
Yes.
Within its theming layers where everything is componentized and it builds small
Stacks.
pieces, build a bigger
Yeah.
application kind of thing. Instead of going top down, you're going component up.
Actually, that's an interesting point. So at the last DrupalCon in May, Chirs, the founder of Drupal, he spoke about where Drupal can go in the future and some concepts for concepts based around surveys that were done. And in particular, the biggest point that came out of that was more improvements to the content authoring experience and a content-first way of working with Drupal. So Drupal 8 has come a long way from the original foundation of Drupal, where it was really is maybe a great long form. It standardizes a lot of thoughts and process around where things have been heading, and the idea of the outside-in approach versus the inside-out approach. And what that basically means is changing the UI interactions, basically an overhaul to the UX of Drupal, so that it's not thinking from a developer point of view of how things work, but how you would interact with components. So drag and drop style interfaces for editing.
It's varying degrees of frustration to deal with complex.
It really has, specifically, but just being able to work with variations on how media is displayed and the kind of interactions media will do with other elements of Drupal, and it's never been a really seamless experience. It's very complex architecting and programming can all happen much towards that, and the media initiative sort of well
the same site. I think it's great.
Yeah, it definitely streamlines a lot of processes.
Yeah.
Jokingly, I said it's made those multi-staging system platforms obsolete in a way.
Right.
Or the original purpose of those for existing. But yeah, I mean, we'll see where all of that goes and how it works well together. Yeah, just kind of hinting at with Chirs' presentation was the authoring experience and how working with Drupal are not even necessarily on the management team or so on. They're in the marketing team or they're just part of staff and they're assigned to be content authors or administrators or whatever. And if they're not having a good experience, then they're not going to like Drupal. And maybe you could argue that they're not really there to like Drupal. They're there to just get their job done and not even know what the tool is to a certain degree. But they're the front line. And if they're having a good time with the system and they like it, they'll recommend it. And it creates more opportunities for Drupal shops, Drupal developers, and so on, and encourages adoption. And then Drupal just becomes better because of that. And so those are the people that you have to please first. And I think that content authoring experience is light years ahead of what we had, and there are constant improvements happening to it. For example, you saw a couple of additions in the WYSIWYG with spell check and other minor little things like that, the constant improvements that are happening there. So continuing the iterative process. Just to kind of jump back to my slide and the concept I was talking about in terms of teams and who's ready. So there are a lot of new things in Drupal. From the developer perspective, object-oriented programming is not something you just jump into casually if you've been a PHP developer doing procedural programming for many years. And as I was saying before we started the presentations, I've worked with a couple of developers who were eager to get into Drupal 8, but they didn't have the skills there yet, and so they couldn't really justify it because, oh, it's new and cool. Well, yeah, when I got into Drupal, I was on a 6-month sabbatical, and I spent the time to get into Drupal 6 when it first came out. And that was really, in my opinion, required time to get into it and comfortable. If you're on the job and working, that's maybe a solid year, or maybe a little more, I don't know. The more you use it, the more you get familiar with it, and the more comfortable you get with it. If you are an object-oriented programmer in your past, or you're coming into Drupal 8 from, say, working with .NET or something now, currently, you can jump into it and be familiar with how those concepts work. So there is a learning curve there as well. I think the learning curve for the site building approach to Drupal, basically the point and clicky stuff is what site builders are called, is a much better experience. And the front end side of Drupal 8 is really, really awesome too, compared to the past. So from that programming development side, there is a bit more of a learning curve to get into, but if you're eager to learn and eager to work with a new cool system, then anything's possible. Yeah. One other thought too on that too is if you have a Drupal 6 site and you want to migrate to another system, Drupal 8 being the obvious one since we're talking about it, you have to look at the budgetary issues and the time issues and what that all looks like, and getting your team up and running on Drupal 8 and working with it is, a migration project is a good way to start, because then you're kind of forced into it. Also because Drupal 6 is at end of life, so that's another side of it as well. But yeah, I don't know, any other thoughts on it?
How robust is the migration process? My worry, if you're...
It's early days.
Yeah, if you're working with a very simple site where you have maybe a couple of defined content types with a few fields, it probably migrates quite cleanly. But if you have any level of complexity, my worry about getting into migration is what happens when you hit edge cases or highly complex
then
sites.
You're in the code.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Drupal 8 out of the box can build that basic site that took a lot of effort in Drupal 6, for example. I guess the common example around that is like a mom and pop shop of some kind when they want a website and they want it running, and maybe they would have gotten a WordPress or Squarespace. Now you can do it up in Drupal 8, and it can get most of that use case taken care of out of core. Those edge cases where you have really complex data sets to deal with, you're probably still looking at doing it all in code. I haven't played around with the new tools in 8.2 right now to see what that's like, but as with anything, if you have very complex edge cases, you're probably looking at doing stuff in code.
Yeah.
But if you've got basic sets of fields and it's all built within the Drupal system itself, then you're probably okay. It depends. Like Drupal 6 was often customized by non-Drupal developers to make certain things happen, and it gets messy. Sometimes you've got complex modules or components that aren't really written to interact with core very, very well, or even at all. I've seen some crazy stuff out there, and you're probably looking at doing stuff in code because maybe it's not even in the Drupal admin interface. Maybe it is just some side project or something like that within the Drupal framework itself.
Right. So do things like views come across in the migration, like views configuration and that kind of thing?
It has for me so far where I've done that, but again, there might be some complex use cases where it wouldn't fit into that. But everything we've said so far, I do want to say the migration that I've seen and the tools that are there and are working really well. But it is those edge cases that you'd have to be concerned with. But I would think you'd be concerned with those anyway, just because you'd have to make sure the data is clean coming across and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. Any other thoughts? Anything else? Was there anything that maybe you saw that caught your eye? Or?
Just curious. Like I know nothing. I'm not a developer or anything, but you showed one template that was the the article with the comment
Yes.
format. What are the other templates? What else could you do with this?
Oh, so basically, I guess we're talking about in Drupal terminology the content types, right? So you mean, so if I want to in this area, so this and is it enough or just so and body title and an email format with pricing and so on. There are Commerce Kickstart is one that is, as you might guess, related specifically to a commerce experience, and it's meant as a sort of starter template Drupal installation to enable you to make a full commerce experience with products and shipping and zip codes and country labels and everything in there. Basically all out of the box. There's a lot of work done on that in the Drupal 8 world right now, and I think a lot of it's ready. I hope so, because I'm about to start building out a commerce site for people. Not sure what else to say about that. So you can make complex content types for any user.
Well, let's pick like Uber, for example. If you want to connect clients or a service provider and manage that transaction.
Speaking of APIs, that's a great example. So Uber's got its API, and you could store information in Drupal related to the Uber product information or client information, and it depends on what you would want to do with the Drupal site itself. Because Uber is, of course, its own app and has all that data. So what would be the use case that you're thinking of?
Well, could you, I don't know, maybe could you prototype a mobile app using this?
Oh, absolutely,
Mimic
yeah.
the Uber type.
Oh, it's to make a clone-like idea of
Yeah,
Uber.
well, I'm just using Uber as an example there.
Okay, you could build an Uber in Drupal if you want. All the fields are available, or you could make them available, I should say. So yeah, I guess my comment about the API doesn't really make any sense in that context, but you could build out something like that for sure. And then you could output that data using the RESTful API feature, and you could literally set it up so that you've got an Uber app on here. So you could replicate Uber with Drupal. Would you want to? Well, Uber exists, so I'm not sure why, but I'm kidding, but
Now I want to build a phone. Uber.
You can really build
Drupal.
anything using Drupal, right? Like
that's really true.
It's literally like what you can build. So I know a lot of people think of it as, hey, I'm just going to build a website. You can actually go way beyond that. You can build back-end workflows for publishing organizations, or you can build front and back. Like it's endless what you can do. So you talk to a lot of people and they're like, oh yeah, it's a website tool. No, it's an application tool. So you can really build anything on top of the platform.
That is really true. Drupal 8 especially is, well, maybe I'm talking out of turn a little bit, but I would say it's engineered for that purpose. To be able to connect with various APIs and to output data in various formats and so on, so that you can interact with other systems like that. And really, you can build those applications. It can do that.
And the great thing too in Drupal 8, integrated what used to be called entity forms into Drupal 8 core, I believe, or a version of it, where you can do complicated gathering of information from your users. If you need to collect, you have a form laid out where you're collecting, maybe you're doing grant applications online, for example. You can have the details of the form set up there. They get collected, stored in the system. You can use views to display and render the reports, and do various things there, and then have information like various content types to talk about the different programs that you offer and that kind of thing. And it's all essentially end user driven, where you can go in and say, well, I need to just add these 4 fields to the form, arrange them the way I want, and then the system starts collecting. You don't have to go through a whole lot of how the hell do I build a web form problem. Have somebody sit there and build you a form and build all the data collection and all the storage mechanisms and all that. It's all out of the box.
All you really need to, well, all you really need to do, that's a horrible way to start. But a way to lead into a project with Drupal 8 is, the classic scenario of creating your user personas, dumping that into a tool like Gather Content, for example, and you you can output the data that you set up in there so that it's ready to be dropped into a CMS like Drupal 8. So the pathway to getting your experience for the users into Drupal 8 is much simpler now than it has been in the past with Drupal 7 and 6 and so on. And that's really what it comes down to. It's all about the experiences in the story and those digital experiences, as they say. So some of what I talk about with things like the PHP standards and what else did I talk about here? The performance. Those are behind the scenes details that are super critically important, but from the perspective of how Drupal gets used, it's hopefully it's that sort of hidden layer that is dealt with and doesn't really affect the other layers of what you're trying to do in terms of that experience and the use cases for Drupal 8. But the real core of it is its ability to interact as a platform and on the API level with other systems, and I guess the efficiency in how it does it, and the flexibility of the system itself. But at its core, it's still a content management system, and it's an amazing storehouse for massive amounts of content. And now it just manages it even better in terms of the storing of it and the usability of how you work with that data.
Actually, doing a really neat thing, speaking of social media, on a project that I'm on right now, I'm using Zapier and services to push content to social media. So I have a set of automated triggers that when you post a node and a certain set of criteria are met, basically there's a checkbox and something else, it'll take that and post to Twitter, and it'll post to Facebook using Zapier webhooks, which is essentially just post calls using Drupal service client. So you can do quite a bit. There's nothing I was going to say, and I lost it.
There's so much to know about Drupal and its 200 plus new features. It's hard to keep it all in the head and all the moving parts. Yeah, any other thoughts from the audience in terms of how would you use Drupal, or what are your thoughts on what you've seen so far?
Well, I like what I've seen so far. It would be interesting. You mentioned you were going to show the multi-language piece as far as content. Good to see that. Beyond that, if you had some visualization libraries like D3 or Chirs.
Yeah. So those, speaking of APIs, those well, D3 is a JavaScript library, right? But there are APIs that will render with Drupal 8 or even Drupal 7, but with Drupal 8 as well, to do those visualizations. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but just check something really quick. Right. So there's a contrib module that does integrations with it. There's nothing available for D8 yet. So that would be something that would be.
Well, you can even take things like Drupal services and expose them to something like Clipfolio or a service like that, and render your data as a dashboard within that kind of environment. Because Drupal will output any sort of REST or semantic data format you want, like JSON, XML, CSV, you name it, it'll do it. And then you can use anything like I said, Clipfolio, there's another one I can't remember the name of right now, and just do those complicated visualizations on the fly.
Yeah, that's the platform aspect of Drupal 8.
So how closely tied are they to those modules? If, for example, someone had developed some functionalities in D3 for another platform, and you wanted to port those over, would it essentially mean rewriting them all, or would most of it work somewhat out of the box?
It's a bit of a hard question to answer without having seen the code behind this particular module, for example, but
I guess it really depends on your data, because if you're using an established thing like D3 that already exists, if you use D3 here, if you use D3 anywhere, you still got to give it data in the same format. it's just a matter of telling Drupal to output in the same way that you already have it. And it, in theory, big air quotes here, it should come across fairly well. There's always surprises, obviously, but if you're using an established system like that, then it's really just a matter of telling it how to.
And you're laughing as you said that.
Air quotes.
Yeah, I can do that. 4 days later.
Well, like I never try to. My first instinct's always to say, "Oh yeah, totally can be done." But in most cases it can be done, but you'll never know until you see the data. And if you might lose 40% of your time in migration alone, because migration is one of those things where you open a window and start throwing stuff out of it. Some of it will hit the truck below, some of it won't.
Depending how old it is.
Yeah.
Another side of this too is, so I've shown you a Drupal 7 version of the module. It might be a better use case to not migrate the module or port the module, as they say, to Drupal 8, but rather just use the API itself and work with Drupal 8's output and vice versa.
Yeah.
That may be a better scenario, so that you wouldn't have to worry about the time or budget to actually do module porting. In some cases, that's going to be absolutely true because it's Drupal 8. In other situations, like for some of the admin tools, like there was an admin toolbar I mentioned, that's just a nice piece to have in the admin interface. But I mean the enhanced one, I should say, drop downs and
Yeah,
so
they
on.
have that.
Yeah.
On me, and it'll
Yeah.
crash everything.
Yeah. But it's okay.
But it's good.
I haven't had any major crashes with it or anything like that. Sometimes there's a flicker when it loads, but yeah, it's good. Sorry, did that answer your question, or did it create more questions?
Well, probably a little bit of both.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from anyone, or should we move on to Q&A, or I guess
I think we're kind of already in Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just say thank you, but we can keep talking, of course.
Yeah.